Latina show.
Hosted by IDM.
When we're live.
Yeah, and it looks like we are live. Hello, everybody. I see already Tecnoir Graphics. Carlos sem S. It's not Carlos, it's Carlo without S. And who cares? Which, by the way, it's his birthday. So
Happy birthday.
Who cares?
Happy birthday, who cares sounds a little bit weird, but yes, we know who cares is the username, not that we don't care. Welcome to yet another installment of the Winter Latina show. Marcelo, how are you doing?
I am tired, but it's all right. It's about holiday times in the...
Do you ever get snow in Italy? Like even like a little sprinkling of snow or not? Not enough.
There is snow where I live. Has not been snowing for a long time, actually. But close enough in Bologna, every now and then you have some good snow. And, I'm not too far from the Alps, from, Italian Alps.
Or I can just take some of our North American snow and fax it to you so you can use it for your own purposes.
Then you can keep it.
I can keep it.
Much trouble.
Through the magic of faxing. Well, today we wanted to go back to the subject of the Middle East. As you guys know, we tried to understand what happened in Syria in the previous episode by discussing all the major players in the region, Turkey, Russia, the US, of course, and Israel and others. And we came up with some theories. So today we wanted to gain a little bit more clarity on the region overall, which is a really daunting topic because it's such a complicated region. But we have an expert to help us. His name is Robert Fantina. He is an American-Canadian journalist, author, and a Middle East expert. He specializes in U.S. foreign policy. When it comes to the Middle Eastern region, he focuses on Palestine. And in fact, right now, he is doing his PhD, focusing on this topic. So he's well equipped to discuss this with us. We've linked all his links to the description. He is an author, and I think once we bring him on, he can tell us a little bit more about himself, so you guys can follow his work. Marcelo, let's bring Robert on.
Let's bring it on. Hello, Robert. How are you doing? Welcome back to the channel.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. How are you?
And welcome to my channel for the first time since we share.
Thank you.
Yes,
I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Robert. So can you please introduce yourself and maybe talk a little bit about your books and where people can follow you so they can understand where you're coming from?
Sure. Can be followed on Twitter at Robert Fantina, Facebook the same. My website is robertfantina.com. My writing involves U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. My most recent book is called Settler Colonialism in Palestine and Kashmir. A lot of people aren't thinking about Kashmir these days, but it's the situation there is not as dire as Palestine is right now, but it's as dire as Palestine was before October 7th of 2023. The occupation, the brutality, the methods that are being used to oppress the people are very similar. Administrative detention, torture, displacement. So it's a topic that has kind of gone to the wayside, but one that I think is important. But I've also written extensively about U.S. foreign policy in general. One of my books is called Propaganda, Lies, and False Flags, How the U.S. Justifies Its War. And another one on foreign policy is Empire, Racism, and Genocide, A History of U.S. Foreign Policy. So I think that gives you a good idea of how I view U.S. foreign policy.
Are your books still on Amazon when you're working with subjects that are a little bit politically incorrect, right? To use that term. I saw that they seem to be, but I wanted to confirm if there's another place where people can find them if they're not on Amazon.
Well, last time I checked, they are on Amazon, but that is, as you said, subject to changes any time. My website, robertfantina.com, is another place they can order them from. But any bookseller should have them.
And now that you reside in Canada, do you find any difference in the way that your work is perceived, your academic work versus having lived in the US previously?
It's more positively received in Canada because, of course, the United States has this image of the greatest country in the world, and everything they do is right, and they don't make any mistakes, and they're all out for human rights and international law. Outside of U.S. borders, these lies are obvious. But within the U.S. itself, many, certainly not all, but many people still believe them.
Okay, that makes sense. And before we get started with the actual topic, I wanted to know, how did you actually get interested in this topic in the first place? Was it academically by learning more about US foreign policy, or was it through activism, human rights activism? What was the impetus for you to get involved?
It was through activism. When I grew up in the United States in a very conservative Republican family, and a lot of the things they were saying just didn't make sense to me. So I started exploring that more. I found that the United States is the biggest violator of international law and its own domestic law, and its oppression of people around the world and within the United States is really appalling. So I started exploring that more, doing research, and then finally writing about it.
Thank you for clarifying that. Well, to get started, we do want to talk briefly about the history of the Middle East. I don't think we're going to go as far as the imperial period. You guys can jump in our episode last week. We briefly talked about the way that the collapse of empires, specifically the Ottoman Empire, created some of the borders that we're dealing with in the Middle East today. We talked about the mandates coming from the League of Nations with Britain and France going into World War II. And we briefly talked about the Cold War. So I think, Robert, if possible, if you could sort of talk about maybe what happened during the Cold War very briefly, and the increased US involvement, and the reasons why the US started to perceive this region as strategically important to its foreign policy.
There are a variety of factors there. One is, after World War II, the United States was really the undisputed most powerful country in the world, at least militarily, and also increasingly economically. And the United States government always wanted to exploit that and strengthen it. So the Middle East, of course, is oil rich, and the United States functions on oil to a great degree as far as its economy and so on. And the threat of Russia gaining more influence in any area of the world is very frightening to US government officials. So in order to do that, they began strengthening their presence throughout the Middle East, in the West world too, but they were focused in the Middle East, building military bases and controlling governments throughout that whole area of the world, seeing that whenever possible, they could force in a government would be sympathetic to U.S. causes. And if that wasn't possible, then they would simply overthrow the government and bring in a new government. Now, to mention Iran, which is sometimes considered part of the Middle East, sometimes not. In 1953, the U.S. overthrew the democratically elected government of Iran and installed the Shah of Iran, who was a brutal, repressive dictator. But he did what the United States wanted. And it was over 20 years before the Iranian people were able to overthrow him. And the United States since then has still been very hostile toward Iran. So this is, rather than working diplomatically with different countries, and certainly any countries are going to have disagreements, but they can be resolved or at least handled through diplomatic channels. The United States prefers terrorism, government overthrow, and intimidation. And that's been the case since the Cold War.
I think the Iran question is really interesting, because this is one of these situations that you can compare to today, where we've, for instance, we had a regime change in Ukraine, and of course that's still being publicly denied. But I know that in maybe 10 years or 20 years, we're going to have all these documents released, much like we did with the 1953 Iran regime change. And if you guys go on our favorite source, Wikipedia, Wikipedia is not exactly a source of objectivity, but it's just kind of amazing that you go and read about something that happened farther back in history. You can read all about the involvement of various intelligence agencies, not just from the US, right, but also from Britain. It's all very, very clear, the way that that particular regime change happened. But as soon as you start extrapolating from that period to some of the more recent events, it's like, no, we no longer do this, which I've always found a little bit curious. But if you could talk a little bit about maybe the changing relationship with certain countries. So for instance, in the Cold War period, Egypt and the Soviet Union initially were quite amicable, but then in the 1970s, there was the shift and Egypt turned towards the US. And it's still very much, I wouldn't call it an ally, it's very much a country friendly with the United States, but at the same time, it's a country that's developing its relationship within BRICS. So this is a little bit of a, interesting situation. We can talk also maybe a little bit about Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Arabia is considered, up until recently, right, the staunch U.S. ally, although there have been some cases in the Cold War period where Saudi Arabia wanted to do what it wanted to do, and the U.S. kind of had to go along with it because of its strategic importance. But these days, Saudi Arabia is sort of diversifying its foreign policy, turning a little bit more towards China, working a little bit with Russia. So if you could highlight some of these countries and how that relationship changed, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, and you mentioned Egypt and the United States, Egypt and Russia. That was the change there was mainly because the United States was willing to spend a lot of money on the Egyptian government to get them to have friendly relations with Israel. A lot of the motivation for U.S. actions in the Middle East pertains to Israel, and we'll certainly get into that during this conversation. Regarding Saudi Arabia is very interesting. It's very oil rich, so the United States needs it, but so do other countries, and Saudi Arabia is aware of its power. It is aware that it can call the shots, at least to some degree, until such point that the United States decides to overthrow that government. That's always a fear of any government throughout the Middle East and through much of the world. But currently, Saudi Arabia has, in the last couple of years, reestablished relations with Iran. This was in a deal brokered mainly by China, which marginalized the United States, and the United States was not at all pleased about that reunification. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next several months with Donald Trump coming back into power in the United States. He and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, are personal friends of high-ranking members of the Saudi government. So we'll see how this plays out. Saudi Arabia has been a staunch supporter, at least nominally, of the Palestinian cause, and its government officials have said that it can't, it won't recognize Israel unless there is what they call it as a realistic path to Palestinian statehood. So let's hope that it holds firm to that, because that would probably be the last barrier to a complete annexation of Palestine by Israel. So that's another area. Now we look at Lebanon, Yemen. Let's talk about Yemen for a minute. The U.S. has strongly supported for years Saudi Arabia's war against Yemen, as they were trying to install or reinstall a government that the people of Yemen don't want. But again, this is typical of U.S. foreign policy. It doesn't really matter what the people want. Despite all the U.S.'s rhetoric about supporting democracy and self-determination, it's not about that at all. So the people of Yemen have been able to resist, for the most part, Saudi's onslaught, although it's been devastating for them. And the truce that was broken a few years ago seems to be holding. But Yemen, again, is a strong supporter of Palestine. And so then that brings the wrath of the U.S. To it. We see the same thing with Lebanon, where Hezbollah is very powerful and remains powerful despite its recent losses. The United States calls that a terrorist group, as it calls Hamas in Palestine. Any military or any organization that the United States finds displeasing to its geopolitical goals, it will name as a terrorist organization. So that's a few of the key players in the Middle East. There are others, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, we're watching the situation unfold in Syria, which is still quite murky, even though we've been trying to understand it for, ever since the Assad government was overthrown. And we're watching in real time how HTS, which is an offshoot of Al Qaeda, is being rebranded not only as this pro-diversity friendly moderate group, but also having that group taken off the terrorist list where it was for quite some time in many countries. So we're definitely watching that happen in real time. Now, I want to ask you about Turkey. Now, Turkey is officially not part of the Middle East, but also it exerts quite a bit of influence in the region. On the one hand, it seems to nominally support Palestine as well. On the other hand, it's very, very involved in Syria. And in fact, it's one of the major players, seems to be, to what happened with Syria. So I wonder if you could comment on that and elaborate a little bit.
Turkey has some issues with the Kurds in Syria and along the border, and that's where the issue with the main problems with Syria are stemming from as far as Turkey is concerned. Turkey's involvement in what has recently happened probably existed, but wasn't as strong as that of the United States and Israel, and mostly the United States. But the Turkish government is watching what's happening and will act accordingly. It will seize whatever side seems to be victorious. It will throw its weight behind that. It doesn't have the same kinds of investment in regime change in Syria that the United States and Israel have or had, but it does want to resolve the Kurdish problem along its border with Syria.
So now let's talk about the elephant in the room. Let's talk about Israel. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the very formation of the State of Israel in the 1940s. It was backed by the United Nations, the major players, the US, the Soviet Union. Harry Truman was sort of one of the first people to recognize it before the rest of the US government did. Uh-oh. Did you hear me? It looked like my mic went off for a second.
I heard you fine.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
So, but I also want to talk about the way that even though U.S. officially supported the formation of Israel, it wasn't immediately the backer of Israel that it is today. So I want to learn a little bit more about how that came to be going into the late 60s and the 1970s.
Okay, good. So you mentioned the formation of Israel. A lot of people are unaware that in 1947, 1948, the newly minted United Nations carved Israel out of Palestine. That action displaced 750,000 Palestinians and killed about 10,000 of them. Now, the genocide that's currently going on has been even more deadly, killing at least 45,000 Palestinians, and some estimates are as high as 150,000, and displacing about 2 million people. So this is how Israel was formed at that time. And then, as you said, for a period of years, the United States just saw it as another country. But during the administration of President Kennedy in the early 60s, this started changing. Now, part of that was because of the ability for Israel to provide intelligence to the United States about other countries in the Middle East that the United States saw as its enemies. So it established within Israel an intelligence center, for lack of a better term, that was able to spy and report back, and that brought it value to the United States. Now, Israel also uses the Holocaust card. Now, no one that I know denies the Holocaust, denies the horror of it, the 6 million Jews slaughtered, absolutely appalling, unspeakably awful. But that doesn't justify the Israelis today doing the same thing, and for generations, displacing people, repressing them, killing them, bullying their homes. But that the U.S. government officials have taken that historical horror and brought it up through the decades so that it will enable Israel, whatever Israel does, well, Israel's the victim. Israel hasn't been the victim in decades. Another important reason why the United States is so pro-Israel is because of pro-Israeli lobbies in the U.S. AIPAC and some others donate millions and millions of dollars to get elected officials, re-elected or initially elected or defeated, depending on their point of view. And then once they get their candidate in office, they write the lobby group writes legislation for that now elected official to introduce in Congress. So the U.S. government often talks about is Russian influence in U.S. elections or Chinese influence in U.S. elections. Why is there never any discussion, I'd like to know, about Israeli influence in U.S. elections when it is right out there in the open with lobbyists spending millions of dollars each election cycle to get their candidates either elected or reelected, and if there's some they don't like, to get them defeated. In the last election, they defeated two very pro-Palestine officials. I think both of them will return, but they were defeated, and that was a big victory for AIPAC. This is foreign influence in U.S. election, but the U.S., as long as U.S. officials are getting those campaign contributions, they're going to ignore that interference.
Now, if we go back to the Kennedy administration and also the Lyndon Johnson administration, and then into the 1970s, what was like you talked a little bit about intelligence, but was there anything else that was going on that made Israel more basically increased its importance to the U.S. at that time? I mean, the U.S. was sort of involved in the Vietnam War. It had other very serious things going on in a different part of the world. But it seems to be that's the turning point where there is much more interest in, well, the Middle East. I know there's obviously that oil crisis that happens in the early 1970s. I think that is sometimes mentioned in this context. How do you view that sort of turning, or kind of a turning point?
Oil is always a big issue for the United States, and U.S. wars are often waged because of oil. Jimmy Carter talked about oil rights, not human rights, not personal rights, individual, but oil rights. So during the Johnson administration and part of the Kennedy administration, there was the recognition that the Middle East is oil rich. The United States needs that oil, and the best way of assuring it was to was to assure that the governments of those countries are favorable to the United States. And Israel, right there in the middle, almost a U.S. satellite, was a kind of a jumping off point to ensure that happened through intelligence, through destabilizing countries, destabilizing governments, and so on. So it was geographically appealing to the United States, and as I mentioned before, financially appealing to U.S. officials.
So I'd like to focus a little bit more on the 1980s. There was a war between Israel and Lebanon. And what I find interesting about that particular war is that the United States wasn't very happy about how far Israel was going in that particular military adventure, let's call it with scare quotes. And behind the scenes, it was really trying to talk the Israeli officials out of going as far as they did. They were, from what I remember, I need to refresh my memory and read some of the documents, they were spending a ton of money in Israel. And so that was really impacting their economy. Their public image was shot much like it is today internationally, but they really didn't care. They just kind of had this one, they sort of had this one focal point, and they were going despite what the U.S. was advising them behind the scenes. And there was also that fiasco with the U.S. Was it Marines? Was the U.S. military involved in that region during the war between Israel and Lebanon? And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that usually it seems that either the U.S. says jump and Israel says how high, or Israel says jump and the U.S. says how high. But behind the scenes, there is a little bit of factional infighting going on. So I wanted to know whether you could elaborate about that.
Yes, that was probably the first major time that Israel said to the United States, we're going to do what we want to do, and you're just going to pay for it. And the United States said, well, okay, we will. The United States didn't want Israel invading Lebanon to that degree. It never minds when Israel will do some bombing and invasions, but nothing that major, because that was a defeat for Israel, and the United States never likes to be on the losing side. But this was a turning point geopolitically for Israel and the United States. It was at that point, as I mentioned, that the Israeli government realized that it was sufficiently important to the United States that it could do what it wanted to do. And we've seen that played out constantly since the 80s. Currently, the United States is saying that Israel has to do more to protect innocent civilians. It's doing nothing to protect innocent civilians. It has to allow more humanitarian aid. It's doing nothing. It is just ignoring the United States, but still taking the United States' money, which the United States is still inconceivably willing to give it in huge amounts. The US and Germany are the two countries that are most responsible for providing the weapons to Israel now that it's using for genocide. But to go back to the 80s, as you mentioned, that was a turning point, and that war, Israel kind of overstepped its bounds, and it was it got caught in doing so, and it was driven back as a result of that. The United States government knew this was going to happen, knew it was biting off more than it could chew, but the Israeli government didn't care because it knew that militarily the U.S. would support it. If its economy was suffering because of its wars, the U.S. would support the economy and boost that up, despite the economic problems in the United States. And that's been a puzzling pattern that we've seen now for over 40 years.
Can you elaborate a little bit about Germany? Is the German role also strategic? Does it have more to do with its history with the Holocaust? Why is Germany so involved today?
It does go back to the Holocaust. And this, I've thought about this, and it's puzzling. 75, 80 years ago, a horrible thing happened that the German government at that time perpetrated. There's no question about that. That government is long gone. That, of course, people need to remember these horrible things to try to prevent them happening again, but we're seeing them happening in real time now. It's puzzling to me that the German government today is willing to fund a genocide when the German government a generation ago committed a genocide. So I don't know what the reason is in the German government's mentality that thinks that they can somehow redeem themselves from a previous genocide by committing another one. But the reason that Germany is so supportive of Israel now and sending so many weapons is to try to prove, yes, we're okay with the Jews, we like the Jews. And there's a huge difference between Jews and Israelis and Zionists. They're different categories. Some people are Jews, Israelis, and Zionists. Some people are Zionists and none of the other two, any combination. But the situation during the Holocaust was the extermination of the Jews. Today, it's the extermination of Arabs, specifically Palestinians. This isn't a religious issue. It's not Muslim versus Jew or anything else. It's international law and human rights, and Germany is violating both to an extreme degree today.
Yeah, it's also perplexing to me. I'm not sure if it's a question of collective guilt and it's coming out in a very bizarre way, as you've just pointed out, but it's something that I haven't been able to wrap my mind around. Before we talk about the other side of the coin, Palestine, I wanted actually to talk a little bit more about what you just described, which is sectarianism. Sometimes you read Western analysis and it seems to be really exaggerated, that it's ethno-religious clashes that are leading to the conflicts in the Middle East. To what extent is it true, and to what extent are these analysts going too far in emphasizing these religious differences between the Sunnis and the Shias and the Jews and and some of the Orthodox Christians, etc.? How do you see this question?
We have to look at history. Prior to the establishment of the State of Israel, Jews were coming to Palestine and they were being welcomed, and they were living peacefully with their Palestinian Arab neighbors. And it was just different people living in the same area with different religious beliefs. It was no issue for them. We look at Iraq prior to the U.S. invasion, when Sunnis, Shias, Shiites were all living together. They had some different beliefs, but they lived peacefully together. It wasn't an issue. After the invasion, of course, that sectarianism grew astronomically, and it is a problem to this day. So recently, Justin Trudeau, Canadian Prime Minister, said that There's a lot of disagreement in the Liberal Party because it has Muslim members as Jewish members. That has nothing to do with the issue. This is not an issue of Muslim and Jew or Christian because they have different large populations of Muslim Jews and Christians have lived together in harmony in the Middle East in the past. This is a question of international rights, international law and human rights. And the United States, Germany, many other countries, and certainly Israel, are violating international law and human rights on a daily basis in the most atrocious manners. That's why there's an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court for Benjamin Netanyahu for crimes against humanity. That this isn't a matter of no one's arresting him because he's Jewish. He's being arrested because he is committing crimes against humanity. There's a warrant for his arrest for that reason. So the idea of this being a religious conflict that is killing hundreds of thousands of people for generations is simply an excuse to some people back to the Bible. Oh, God's chosen people. Well, they're misreading the Bible for one thing. For the second thing, not everyone believes in the Bible, and governments aren't run through the Bible. So this is the idea of religious differences causing these conflicts is a lie of huge proportions.
Let me jump in here just a second. I found this very, very interesting. First of all, I'd like to give a big shout out to Cletus, who seemed to be the first time in the channel. He enjoyed and sent Nina a super chat. Thank you, Cletus. So Robert, what you just said is very interesting to me. You know, I was talking, the last week I had like 6 or 7 different episodes about what's happening on Syria, trying to understand things better, trying to understand the dynamics of everything, and trying to understand the West Asia, you know, by the religious divisions and everything. So I had this conversation with a friend. And so he's Muslim. He works for a channel called Islamic History, Brazilian channel, and he was at some point I was trying to understand exactly the situation in Syria. So we have Iran. So Iran is Shia, and then you have Turkey. Turkey is Sunni, but also Salafi. And I trying to understand the dynamics of how things are going to develop there. And many things were not making sense to me because exactly my mind was fixed on the point that, this is Shia, this is Sunni, this is Israelis are Jews and all that. At the same time, Iran has a type of a religious government. How does this apply on the region, on the relations between the countries there, and how do you see this developing as well in the region now? We are going to go back later, but I just want to understand, how do you see the development of these relations that we mentioned before, that Iran and Saudi Arabia, same thing, just came back to having diplomatic relations. How do you see this religious thing in the politics or not?
Well, Iran has basically a religious government, but yet it has alliances with other countries in the area whose religious beliefs are different. The need for political alliances transcends religious beliefs and religious ideology. Countries need to have defense pacts with each other. They need to have trade pacts with each other. So it doesn't really matter whether they worship in a mosque, a temple, or a cathedral. That this is what is pragmatically, what is the geopolitical goal of affiliating with another country. So Iran can have its religious government, and the government doesn't operate, doesn't exclude alliances or make alliances based on another country's major religion. So this is just pragmatic politics in the world. So I don't see that as a major, as any kind of a barrier to Iran or any other country establishing relations for trade, education, or anything else with any countries that it chooses to.
I mean, Iran has obviously been developing a strategic relationship with Russia, but beyond that, Russia being a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, but the dominant religion is Russian Orthodoxy, Christianity. But beyond that, you actually have religious leaders from Iran meeting with religious leaders from the Russian Orthodox Church every few years, and they hold councils. And it's not so much like an interfaith kind of rapprochement. It's more about what do we do in the modern world and how do we basically ward off some of these damaging, from their perspective, some of these damaging secular issues, some of the radical secular agenda that comes from the ideology of liberalism or post-liberalism. So there's that going on. And those two are obviously pretty far removed from each other in terms of Orthodox Christianity and Shia Islam, right? So I think Robert is right about pragmatism trumping some of these religious differences, but I think there are also two other issues where these religious differences become much more obvious in a state of chaos. And so when you have the case of Syria and having these radicals take over and topple a legitimate government, all of these things are now going to be pitted against each other. This is just what happens in chaos. When things are reasonable and a government is stable, there's just not going to be that much religious infighting or ethnic infighting or whatever. But the other issue, I think, is retroactively going back to, the Crusades or something like that and looking at that conflict, which it wasn't just a religious conflict. It clearly had geopolitical implications too. And then using that and applying it to the modern context. This is just kind of like, sometimes you have these, I don't know if I call them historians. I guess they're more like propagandists. They would go back to the Middle Ages and talk about the feminism of such and such famous nun. And it's not really the way this nun would have perceived herself as a feminist. I mean, you could sort of talk about the way women perceive themselves without going that far. So I kind of see it in that, through that prism, where you're sort of doing things that are ahistoric, going back 1,000 years or even more, and then applying it to today where it might not really be that applicable. But let's shift gears a little bit. We talked about Israel and Israel-US relations. Let's talk a little bit about Palestine. We can talk about it historically after the establishment of Israel. And also, we want to sort of bring this to the modern period and the relationship between Israel, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, maybe Yemen as well, in basically the past 2 years. So let's go back.
Okay, so there are a number of things there. The establishment of Israel, as we mentioned before, was a disaster for the Palestinian people. It's called the Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic. And the problems that are in the Middle East, at least Israel, Palestine, stem from the fact that Israel has not recognized its own borders, and it continues to expand them. In 1948, the United Nations, however unjustly, established Israel and Palestine. Yet Israel continues to encroach. There are now over about 800,000 illegal settlers living on Palestinian land. And Benjamin Netanyahu has said none of them will ever have to leave. It is a violation of international law for an occupying power to move its residents permanently into the occupied territory. There's also the fact that the occupying power has the responsibility to protect the occupied people from harm, to provide a medical assistance when needed. We think during the pandemic, when Palestinians were receiving vaccines and Israelis were stealing them, we're taking them officially from them. And of course, the need to protect is just a farce at this point. So Israel continues to encroach on its borders, saying it needs these for its security. Everything Israel does is always for national security. No matter what crimes it commits, it's always, national security, national security. Someone mentioned right now, or in the last several weeks, Israel has been bombing Palestine, Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, and Iran, and yet Israel says it's the victim. So this is just not. It's completely illogical. So the issues that are erupting in the Middle East today have been ongoing at a lower level for generations. And for the Palestinian people, the suffering has been ongoing since 1948. Now, the United States provides all the military aid and economic aid that Israel demands, and including the Iron Dome, which of course it intercepts most of the rockets that are fired into Israel from anywhere. So my question is, if the United States wants peace in the Middle East, why doesn't it provide an Iron Dome for all the countries in the Middle East? Then no one would be able to bomb anybody else, and then they might have to talk at that point. But that's not in the U.S.'s interest. The U.S. does not want peace in the Middle East. It needs a place to sell its weaponry. It needs the continued support of Israel for espionage and for just destabilizing other governments so that they will continue to send oil to the United States. So this is not, well, there are many ways that there can be peace brought to the Middle East. The United States isn't interested in any of them, and neither is the Israeli government, which is strange because the government knows that the people of Israel cannot sleep peacefully at night unless there is peace with the Palestinians.
So from the Israeli perspective, is it that they perceive themselves to be living in this hostile environment and the only way to survive is through expansion? It seems to be that type of mentality where the farther they go in their mind, the safer they are, which of course doesn't actually work out this way because it creates more chaos and more unpredictable situations all around the perimeter. How do you view their perception of it?
The government's perception, at least, is that it needs this security border. So Israel is here, although the borders are very nebulous, and then it needs a security border, which of course encroaches on Palestine, to protect it. So then, as it continues to build settlements and expand its borders, then it needs more. It needs to move its security border, which moves more into Palestinian land and encroaches more. So the fact that there are Palestinian homes and farms there, schools, mosques, businesses, doesn't matter. They get destroyed in the name of Israeli security. No one ever talks about Palestinian security, which Palestine doesn't have. But Israeli security is, for some reason, sacred, and the United States will do whatever it takes to provide Israel's definition of its security, which just means continual expansion, annexation, and defeat and repression of the Palestinian people.
Let's talk a little bit more. Okay, go ahead.
But it's written in the book that they wrote themselves that they are the special people, and God Himself told them that. So I
always wonder to what
extent
extent that is. Well, to what extent is that actually believed? I know the biblical justification. Maybe when it comes to the Christian Zionists in America, I think some of them truly believe it, but I'm not sure to what extent the rest of the people who actually mention it truly believe it, or it's just kind of a PR technique to appeal to these Christian Zionists, these evangelicals in the U.S. I've never really figured that one out. I don't know, Robert, if you have an opinion about it.
I think that's true. A large number of Israeli Zionists are atheists, and yet they say that God gave them the land. Now, politicians have said that the Jewish support for Israel for years has been fading in the United States, but evangelical support is growing. So the evangelicals who are misreading the Bible and saying that God gave this land to the people, they will continue to send money to Israel to plant not plant olive trees, but to plant trees that are where the olive trees had grown for 1,000 years. So it's the evangelicals that are buying into this chosen people myth, and that's who's supporting them. But within Israel, I don't believe that that's a strong belief. I think the people there, a lot of them just want to expand they want to live comfortably, and the only way they know how to do that is by killing the Palestinians, and they're happy to do that.
Yeah, I think sometimes you see those interviews, and I'm not an expert like you, and just the lack of self-reflection in terms of what's being projected to the public just blows my mind. But apparently, when you're sort of living in this echo chamber, you probably don't have much self-reflection. You kind of think that everyone else subscribes to what you're saying. But now let's talk a little bit more about Palestine from the standpoint of international law and attempts to give Palestinians more rights. We obviously have all these UN resolutions that seem to be meaningless about the illegality of these settlements. I mean, you can go on the UN website and look them up yourself. We had the establishment of the Palestinian Authority that doesn't really seem to have much power. Where do you view these legal attempts to try to maybe create a state for Palestine? Obviously, there's the question of the two-state solution. This is a topic that's very hotly debated. Where do you view this particular domain?
Well, this is the future of Palestine needs to be determined by the Palestinians. Now, the U.S. government has issued policies. I think it's even passed resolutions in the United Nations saying that it's two countries living side by side, borders to be determined by negotiation. So negotiations between Palestine and Israel are just nonsense. Negotiations can only take place between two parties when each one has something the other wants, and it can only get by giving up something it has. Israel takes whatever it wants from Palestine with complete impunity. Israeli governments will say, "Oh, we're willing to have negotiations with no preconditions." Well, that's because they can do whatever they want to with no preconditions, and no one's going to stop them. Now, regarding the United Nations and international law is very clear. I talked about some of the regulations pertaining to occupation, but also the borders were established by the United Nations. It's also against international law for a country to gain territory through conquest and through annexation, which is what Israel is doing and has been doing for decades. Excuse me. It's also the idea of Israel left the Gaza Strip about 15 years ago. The IDF terrorists left, but Israel, according to the United Nations, or Palestine, the Gaza Strip is still occupied because Israel controls all its borders, land, sea, and air, regulates what goes in, what comes out, who goes in, who goes out, regulates all their trade, all their how much medicine can come in and everything else. So this is the international law is very clear. Excuse me. International law is very clear. Now, when the United States has vetoed most of the resolutions criticizing Israeli actions in Palestine. Excuse me. After a couple of weeks ago, the United States vetoed another ceasefire agreement, and what they said was that it didn't call for the release of hostages before the ceasefire. It called for the release of hostages after the ceasefire. That was enough for it to veto it. And the assistant ambassador to the UN said that the United States has done more than any other country to bring about a ceasefire. The United States is providing all the weaponry for the genocide. So it's hypocrisy. But as far as violation of international law and the inability of the United Nations to do anything, it's really shocking. The General Assembly, which doesn't have any real legal binding, like the Security Council has overwhelmingly voted in support of Palestine, in support of ceasefire, in support of end of occupation, in support of the end of the blockade, repeatedly. But and that's like 150 some or 60 some members, overwhelmingly voting. And 14 members of the Security Council, 12, 14, I can't remember at the moment. But why do they have so much say? And some countries have veto power over that, when the larger, more democratic body in the United Nations doesn't have any authority.
Yeah, this seems to be the question of raw power overriding any kind of international agreements in this particular case. So now let's shift gears and talk about the most recent developments. I mean, we can start with October 7th, but basically you briefly touched upon Israel striking southern Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, right, West Bank, and Yemen. If you could talk a little bit more in more detail about the maybe specific context of these particular strikes, what you think the intention is, the ultimate intention there. And I know it's very difficult to make predictions, especially in the case of Syria. That is a dynamic situation that just happened, and we're still, even though we kind of know what officially is supposed to be factual, there's still so many theories circulating. But if you can kind of tie it all together, if possible. I know it's a lot to ask.
Okay, well, the reason hostilities between Israel and Lebanon have been are a direct result of the Israeli genocide in the Gaza Strip. Hezbollah has been very supportive of Palestine forever, really, since its existence, and was doing some bombing of Israeli areas in protest of the genocide. The same with Yemen, and the same with Syria, and also Iran to a lesser degree. But Israel then bombed Lebanon very brutally, killing thousands of people as a response to this. But it's the old, like the schoolyard kids. A teacher says, "Why did you hit him?" "Because he hit me back." So this is the idea that these things didn't happen in a vacuum. Lebanon didn't just start arbitrarily didn't start arbitrarily bombing Israel. There was a reason. Israel was bombing Lebanon's ally, Palestine, and Lebanon was reacting to that. Same with Yemen and Syria. And the situation in Syria, which, as you said, is very volatile right now, and some people are portraying it as a people's movement overthrowing a corrupt government. Now, no one that I know is going to praise the government of Bashar al-Assad. He was brutal. He was repressive. We all know that. But what's happening now, the things we're hearing now, are that his generals were bribed to allow these terrorists to overthrow them. And yes, prisons have been opened. That's a wonderful thing. People are being released who were unjustly held. But also, and again, we're hearing things, we don't know how much accuracy there's, but we're hearing that Syrian soldiers who are surrendering to the terrorists, insurgents, are putting out their hands and they're being executed right there on the spot. So we're not looking at a popular movement coming in and overthrowing a corrupt government, which is basically what happened in Iran in the 70s. It was a popular, almost, but not completely, bloodless overthrow of a corrupt government. That's not what we're seeing here. We're seeing Israel and the United States they've been fomenting unrest for years, supporting terrorist organizations, anti-government organizations. They want a regime change. Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State under Barack Obama, once said the best thing we can do for Israel is destabilize Syria. Well, it took a while, but look what's happened now. So Israel is bombing Syria, has destroyed all its defensive capabilities, destroyed records of birth records and so on by its bombings. So this is going to be what I think we're going to see. And I mean, as you said, it's hard to predict the future, but this paves the way for the United States to install a puppet government that will recognize Israel, that will provide oil to the United States as much as it wants, that will block any transfers of weaponry from Iran to Lebanon, and in the meantime, while they're doing that, repress the people the same way they were repressed for the last several decades.
Yeah,
So
Israel
go ahead.
has the right to defend itself, right?
Right. Yeah.
Well, I think the one interesting thing, sort of as a side issue, is that the Israeli strikes in Syria seem to be much more precision-based than the Israeli strikes in Gaza. So you can see that they can, in fact, not target civilians, but that kind of raises a lot of very obvious questions about the way they've been striking Palestine in this particular iteration of this very lengthy conflict. So again, I know it's a very difficult question, but what do you think the overarching goal is for Israel? Was it just to cut off these supply lines that you mentioned? Was it to push this there's the real nebulous border, and then there's the security border, right? The buffer zone. Is it to go past the Golan Heights that have been occupied since 1967? Some analysts, as I mentioned to you before we jumped on this episode, talk about the Greater Israel Project, where all of this is foreplanned in advance, and this is part of strategy. Other analysts say, no, this is not the case. This is much more opportunistic. The situation arose thanks to, partly U.S. foreign policy, Turkish foreign policy, et cetera, and Israel just, was kind of ready to step in. How do you view that particular question?
I think there's a kind of the two are combined. It was opportunistic, but that opportunity was created by the United States in concert with Israel. Israel does have this plan for Greater Israel to encompass so much of the Middle East, and Syria was vulnerable. So I think the United States government said we're gonna increase our terrorist activity in Syria. We're gonna bribe military leaders, and then once Bashar al-Assad leaves the country, then Israel, do what you want to do. So I think it was a combination of both, the desire for Greater Israel and an opportunity that presented itself, although there was some manipulation of that opportunity. I also want to, if I could comment for a minute, Marcelo said that we talked about kind of facetiously Israel's right to defend itself. Just to clarify that, every country has a right to defend itself. However, there is no regulation in international law that provides for an occupying country to defend itself against the occupied, against its victim. However, the occupied country has the right to resist the occupation in any way at its disposal, including armed struggle. That's just a little aside. But to get back to Syria and Israel's goal there, as I said, I think it was an opportunity that was created by the United States in consultation with Israel. Israel was busy battling Lebanon and committing genocide in Gaza, and also in the West Bank. I don't want to ignore the West Bank by any means. They're having an awful time there, worse than usual. But it wasn't really that concerned with Syria. It annexed the Golan Heights years ago against international law. That was recognized by the United States during the Trump administration, but U.S. recognition of an illegality doesn't make it legal. But Israel jumped on this opportunity, and now it's gotten what it wants in Syria or from Syria.
So go ahead.
One perception that has come to my mind recently is that also at the same time, there is the situation in Russia, of Russia, of course, there. They have their bases there, which is still unclear what's to happen from now on. But one thing that passes through my mind is that Israel is starting to put itself in kind of a quagmire, because he was having a hard time in Gaza, which wasn't a big resistance. Hamas, yes, they had some professionals, some training, but they were 30,000 people. I don't know what's the numbers now, but there is no evidence that large numbers of Hamas personnel have perished on this. They had a hyper hard time on South Lebanon. And now they are going in what it seems to be a friendly kind of environment, with the Al-Qaeda terrorists. But at the same time, it's not certain that it's going to be, that walk in the park. Especially that we had Erdogan and even the Al-Qaeda people asking for Russians to keep no, just keep the bases here. It's all right. And the Russians are kind of, we don't care. You wanted this mess? All right, we can go home, no problem. So what do you think about this situation? Because it's starting to seem to me, that the West has been spending a lot of time in the last decades to put a lot of fire around Russia. And yeah, I'm bringing Russia to the topic now. And right now, it just seems like Russia. Okay, that's your problem now. I don't care about this. I'm leaving, and it looks to me that they were not expecting that. They were like, "Oh, but perhaps it's not a good idea that you leave." What do you take from that?
Well, so as far as Russia's involvement in Syria and not intervening in any way in the Syrian in what's happened the last week or so, is that basically your question? So what I see is
The question is more focused on the situation for Israel and the West, because it seems like the Middle East is becoming a big erupting volcano,
powder cake. Mhm.
and the people that were trying to keep some stability there are just okay. That's your problem.
Mhm. Okay, right. It's reached the point. Of course, Russia is bogged down, and Ukraine has those issues in addition to economic issues. The United States has lit the fuse on the powder keg of the Middle East, and the only it can only be stopped by the United States, and the United States isn't willing to do that. The outcome of what's happening now could be disastrous for the world because we don't know yet what Iran is going to do. Iran isn't going to let Syria just become a part of Israel or a U.S. satellite without some kind of resistance. People have said, well, Iran hasn't done anything yet. Well, the Iranian government, unlike the U.S. government and the Israeli government, is one that will bide its time, that will look strategically at what the best action is. It won't simply do a knee-jerk reaction. Oh, we've been bombed. You're going to be bombed. It will explore the possibilities and look at the ramifications. Do what is best for Iran and the Iranian people, and that we don't know what that's going to be yet, but it's going to be something certainly. The other major players, so many of the Western countries are so beholden to the United States financially, militarily, that they're afraid to take a stand. This is so short-sighted. For one thing, history will judge them harshly, these leaders harshly, because they allowed and in some cases financed a genocide, the same way that history judges Hitler harshly, and others who looked the other way when that was happening. So they are counting on the United States to do something to calm down the situation in the Middle East, and yet they know Donald Trump is coming to power, and that's a huge question mark. He also will do anything that any dictator asks him to do, and people like Putin and Netanyahu know how to play him. They know how to get exactly what they want. And for Israel, that's not difficult because the U.S. always gives it what it wants. But the United States will go even farther for Israel under Donald Trump. So I think the world is frightened. We've looked at the atomic clock, which is closer to midnight than it's ever been. People know that the situation in the Middle East could spiral out of control at any time and could engulf the entire world. So there is fear everywhere, but the only vehicle to control that is the United Nations, which is completely ineffective, proven itself to be ineffective because of the way the Security Council is structured. The ICC has its hands tied. It's doing some action, same with ICJ, International Court of Justice. The fact that Netanyahu has been an arrest warrant has been issued for him is something. But some countries are saying, even countries that are signed on the ICC are saying they won't honor that. So where is international law?
Well, I think, again, going back to the question of uncontrolled chaos, that there will be consequences that are impossible to foresee right now beyond what Iran will do. We can go back to what happened with the NATO strikes on Libya and opening that refugee flow into Europe, which in some ways has been disastrous for Europe. This may lead to something even bigger, potentially, depending on how the situation will play out. So I think you're exactly right about not really having that foresight for some of these leaders in Europe that seem to follow the big brother instead of pursuing their own domestic course. But let's maybe to wrap up this episode, let's talk a little bit about international law. Now, some would say that having no international law versus some international law, even its spotty applications, is better than nothing compared to what the situation was like maybe in the early 20th century or the late 19th century. But is there any way where that application could be a little bit more consistent? Because obviously it's the question of sovereignty versus international law. Some people say that if it's possible to pursue the course that is much more multipolar, which is what China and Russia are trying to pursue. And they always go back to saying that it's possible to use the UN more effectively than it is today. And there's all this talk about including other countries on the UN Security Council as one of the solutions. Do you see that as a possibility, or do you think the entire system needs to just be collapsed and overhauled and created from scratch?
Regarding international bodies, the United Nations specifically, the United States will never allow it to change to the degree that it needs to be effective. The United States wants to have the power to veto anything it wants to veto and protect its allies. U.S. representatives, senators have said when the arrest warrant was issued for Netanyahu, well, that's not what the ICC is for. It's not for our allies. It's for the Putins of the world and so on. No, it's for everybody. This is international law. It applies to everybody. So with the United States having that attitude and having veto power in the United Nations, the only way that it could be made more effective is for the authority of the Security Council to be given to the General Assembly. But in order for that to happen, the United States would have to agree, and that's something the United States will never agree on. The United States, when the United States or makes its agreements with countries around the world for military bases, there were 1,000 military bases. That's a topic for another conversation. It makes agreements with the countries that its soldiers will be immune from any crimes they commit in the host country. How is this just? Where is any idea of fairness with this? And they're guilty. Soldiers have been guilty of rape, murder, extortion, all kinds of things, but they can't be charged in that country. So the idea that the United States would look for a more just United Nations, for a more just world order, for lack of a better term, is ludicrous. The United States will never do it because that's not in keeping with its personal geopolitical goals.
Just an FYI for everybody, what Robert just said about the soldiers in foreign countries. He's not only talking about poor countries or countries that nobody. Here in Italy, there are cases of very, very veiled cases of issues, let's put it this way, with NATO forces in NATO.
A lot of it is public knowledge. I mean, I'm a fan of East Asia, so I kind of pay attention to what happens in Japan in this regard, and also in South Korea. And I mean, there are YouTube videos from viral YouTubers covering these topics where a tank would, let's say, run over some civilians because they're driving inebriated and nothing really happens, or worse, like, cases of SA. I don't think YouTube likes the full RAPE word. So this is definitely something that if you were to look into this question, it's available in English language media. Sometimes it's coming from those countries. And yeah, nothing really persecution wise happens, at least not to the extent that it should, if it were the citizens of those countries that perpetrated those crimes. So yeah, I think it's kind of a side topic, but it's definitely one that's very revealing about the overall situation. Marcelo, do we have any questions, or is it mostly comments in the chat?
Yeah, most of it were comments. There is one question recent from Who Cares? How can we get the U.S. government to stop supporting funding the ISRL? Holding signs doesn't do, you know what? We just get called. I mean, I think the main question: how do you get the U.S. government to stop supporting the ISRL people?
Right? The Zionist regime. One of the main ways would be to pass laws in the United States that prevent foreign countries from lobbying, from contributing to the campaigns of elected officials, and even to prevent them from lobbying, because they're not lobbying for the good of the people of the United States. They're lobbying for the good of a foreign country. This shouldn't be legal, and there are certain regulations against it, but Israel isn't held to those. The Zionist entity isn't held to those. But that would be a major way of doing it, because people see the injustice that's being perpetrated on the Palestinian people, and government officials are looking the other way because it's financially beneficial to them. For U.S. officials, money always takes precedence over international law and human rights.
Marcelo, do you have any? I know you've been mostly quiet. You've asked a couple of questions. Do you have any questions you want to ask before we wrap this up?
We are about the time for ending the episode. I think my questions are too broad to bring up right now. I think the conversation took a very great spectrum of history and current affairs. So I think we can finish like this. It's been a great conversation, as
Robert,
always.
do you want to thank you for so much for coming on and sharing your expertise? Do you want to share anything recent that you're working on? I know you sort of highlighted your websites. Is there anything like a new book that you might be working on that you would like our listeners and viewers to know about?
Right now, I'm just working on my PhD research. So I'm researching the lived experiences of pro-Palestinian activists in Ontario during the time of the current genocide. So that will be a book eventually, but not right now. But I want to thank you for this opportunity, and I would love to come on again and discuss this in more detail, or U.S. bases, or any other topic that I'm familiar with.
Yeah, I think we can narrow it down for another episode, and there also will be more clarity, I think, regarding Syria and regarding Iran as official news rolls in. And I think we'll be able to actually not just speculate based on what happened in the past, but actually operate with a little bit more information. So that would be really helpful. Well, thank you so much once again. Thank you guys for tuning in. Marcelo?
Yeah, thank you very much, Robert, for coming back and for coming to the Winter Latina show. It's been a great conversation. It's been 2 excellent episodes that we had together. The invitation is already open, so you're back whenever you feel like. The doors are open.
Whenever you need a break from the PhD research, which could be very daunting and seemingly endless. So
thank you.
Don't tell me about those things. Remember, everybody, that all the links are on the description. Robert links are on the description as well. To support the channels, you know how to do it. You can buy in a coffee or give super chats. And thank you for those who sent super chats today. Everybody, we are going probably to see you next week.
But it might recorded episode, because this is the new calendar Christmas for those of you who celebrate. So, but exactly. we will see you.
For me, it's going to be Christmas time. But
Merry Christmas, Marcelo.
Oh, thank you very much. But you tell me on the recording.
That's very true. I will greet you with a Christmas greeting in the past into the future, as we sometimes do. Exactly. Thank you again, Robert. We'll certainly have you back. And yeah, thank you guys for tuning in. See you soon.
Bye-bye.